Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of our online talk show Coffee Under the Cultural Bridge, where we meet professionals from different areas of life and we talk about their experience with bridging differences. In our last episode, we met Nima Motazet, who is an experienced international leader and who currently manages an organization of almost 2,000 employees of very diverse cultural backgrounds. We talk about his very personal transition from Iran, the country of his origin, to Austria. And also we discuss how critical the intercultural skills are for anyone who wants to succeed working in multinational settings. In case you missed that episode, you can still find it on our YouTube channel, Cultural Bridge, or if you watch this episode till the end, you will find the link to previous episodes there. In today's episode, we will be talking about a very sensitive topic of race and racism. In my work of an intercultural educator, I meet teams from all around the world and of very diverse backgrounds. And what I experienced recently is a growing number of racial statements, and more often than not, people who share or hold these racial views, very often they have little understanding of what racism is. So I have decided to have a close look at topics such as race, racism, and how it reflects in people's attitudes and actions. Our today's guest is from San Francisco, California, and he knows a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. He is the Chief Visionary Officer of a management consulting and coaching company. His clients have ranged from LinkedIn to the United Nations. His area of expertise include men's leadership, LGBT inclusion, storytelling, and cultural intelligence. He is a visiting professor in France, a lawyer, and he received his doctorate in educational leadership. He is a poet and an author of 3 music albums, which you can find on iTunes. Please help me welcoming our today's guest, Dr. Joel Brown. Joel, welcome to our show and thank you very much for coming all the way from San Francisco to Bratislava.
Dobré ráno.
Dobré ráno. Joel, before we start talking about racism, I think it's important to have an understanding of what race is. So I have this provocative question for you. Back in 2003, the scientists confirmed, or they've completed their project, which they called Human Genome Project, and they confirmed that race doesn't exist. What are they trying to tell us?
Well, no disrespect to those with the Human Genome Project. Part of my thought is that they probably used their money in a way that was not really addressing the issue. Because race is not about biology and it's not about physiology. Race is a social construct. It is a social dynamic. It is a societal phenomenon. So what do I mean when I say that? Race is really the idea that one group, one particular ethnicity or race is normative or normal and that they are superior. That has nothing to do with what's in our bodies. That has nothing to do with genetics. That is how society operates. And what we're basically saying by talking about race in that way is that some people, some groups have more value than others. Now, when we talk about racism, it's also important to look at the 3 different dimensions of racism. So there's individual racism, there's interpersonal racism, there's cultural, and there's also institutional. There's also overt racism, racism that's obvious, and there's also covert racism that's hidden. There's also intentional racism, where you intend to create harm, and there's unintentional. So racism has to be understood within that context. And I think that when people talk about genetics, they're missing the point. And I'm glad that they did that in order to affirm our humanity. But unfortunately, that does nothing to really dissect and properly understand racism as it plays out across the globe.
So when we say and when scientists say that race is not biological, I can imagine few people who will watch this interview, they will say, okay, so race is not biological, but we do see some biological differences. Here we are, I have different skin color, I have no hair or different hair, different eyes color. So why are we saying that race is not biological?
Because there's nothing inherent in who we are as human beings that says that we are different racial groups. It's the meaning that we attach to those differences. So for example, if you see my skin tone, if I see your skin tone, is what value do we attribute to that? And as a society, we have made certain value judgments about who people are based on how they look. There's nothing in the natural order of life and humanity that says, because you have light skin, I should think one way, or because I have dark skin, you should think a different way. we have given these meanings and created these definitions based on how we would like to order society. So that's what I mean when I say that it's not something based on physiology. Yes, does it have a connection to physiology? Yes, but only because we have given it that connection, not because it's something that's naturally occurring by nature or because of our development as human beings.
Europeans often say that racism is a US problem, and in Central Europe, where I am based, I very often hear people saying, we don't have black communities, so we don't have this issue with racism. What would be your response to that?
I would love to think that the US was the only place that had racism, but that's unfortunately not true. I think we have to look at racism along a spectrum. So it's not just about Black people, it's about anybody who doesn't fit a certain standard. So this can apply to Arabs, it can apply to Muslims, it can apply to refugees, it can apply to anyone who is not seen as somehow being the ideal. So let's just take this context, for example. We're in Slovakia. Anybody who is seen as being different and not adhering to or belonging to what is normalized, that is an indication or evidence of racism. So you don't have to have Black people. All you have to do is have an idea of who is, once again, normal or normative, and someone or various groups who are different. And that's how it can play out. And I would also say that based on what I hear in Europe in terms of white nationalist movements, neo-Nazi activity, what I've seen in different venues and in different areas that I've read about, whether it's around sports, whether it's around media, whether it's around politics, I find it strange, to say the least, that anybody would think that racism doesn't exist in Europe as well as in America. We know that racism has played out historically all across the globe. Whether we're talking about colonialism, whether we're talking about imperialism, whether we're talking about slavery, which also had its origins in Europe as well. So that's just simply not true. And like I said, while I would love to think that Americans are the only ones struggling with this, that's simply not accurate.
Where does racial hierarchy come from?
Well, I think racial hierarchy comes from those who are in power and from those who believe that because of who they are and what group they belong to, that they should be entitled to certain privileges and benefits in society. And so when we look throughout history, the groups that have had power, the groups that for whatever reason have had access to weapons and money and capital and human labor, they get to set the rules. Historically speaking, that is usually those who are coming from a Eurocentric or European context. That doesn't mean that within smaller systems across the globe, you can see racism play out in different ways. But if we're thinking globally, not just in the US, not just in, let's say, parts of Africa or Asia or other parts of the world, but if we're thinking globally, racism has been primarily a product of ethnocentrism by Europeans. That doesn't mean like no one else can be racist, but once again, we're looking at it from a global scale.
Many believe that being racist means verbally or physically attacking someone of different skin color.
True.
And since they don't do that, since they don't attack the others, they can't be racist.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit more about institutional and interpersonal racism?
Right. When we think about verbal and physical attacks, what we're thinking about are those examples that are most obvious. And it becomes an easy way for people to say, well, I'm different because I didn't attack you, I haven't said anything. But we have to think about if a person does attack me because I am different, because they believe that I am inferior, because they think they are superior, where does that belief come from? That belief comes from an ideology and messages that we receive all throughout society about who is normal, what's ideal, who should be entitled to certain things and who should not be entitled to certain things. Those ideas are what we call biases. And biases are the mental impressions that we have that say what is good and what is bad. Biases can also morph into stereotypes. So we make ideas or come to conclusions about people based on data that's not entirely accurate, or we will assign what we believe or see with one person to an entire group. We also know that there's prejudice, and prejudice can be what I call the emotional commitment to ignorance. When we have data or we have information about people, but we hold on to a view that views them negatively. And these types of views and these types of attitudes are communicated and affect media, healthcare, education, economic policy, art, religion, how we handle different things in the socioeconomic space. So they play out in a multitude of ways. So even if you don't act upon your bias or your stereotypes or your prejudice, you can still have racist thoughts because thoughts are the precursor to action. Before you think or you do something, you have to think it. And before you think it, you have to feel it. And so I want people to understand that even if you say nothing, that doesn't mean that you don't have some racism or a bias that you may have to at some point address and hopefully eliminate.
So that would be racism at individual level, right? Or interpersonal level. And what about racism at institutional level? How does that reflect?
Well, it reflects in how societies are organized, who's able to get certain educational opportunities. So, for example, policies are created based on to say that certain groups should have certain advantages. And so let me just give you one example. When we're thinking about the immigration crisis, okay, and what we're seeing across Europe, we know that in many countries, there are privileges given to people who come from different backgrounds. So if you, for example, look a certain way, if you come from a particular country, you are going to get certain advantages around immigration. It's going to be easier for you, and you're going to be seen as someone who can easily integrate into society. Whereas if you come from a different place, someone might think, well, you wouldn't understand Slovakian values, or you might not be able to easily integrate, or you coming here poses a threat to our national security simply by how you look or simply by where you happen to be. That is an example of racism. Even if you don't consciously think that, there's also a difference between intent and impact. So you can think and have what you think are the most honest and rational reasons as to why you have a policy, but who is it negatively impacting? And we know, for example, with immigration, it disproportionately impacts people of color, people who are from Arab or Muslim nations, and people who, for whatever reason, have a certain status. That's also racism. And that's where I said it can be intentional, unintentional. Even if I don't think or I'm not acting in a negative way, if I am creating policies and behaviors that negatively impact one group and they're disproportionately disadvantaged over a significant period of time, that's also an indication of racism.
Some time ago, I read a book, Why I Am No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and one term really caught my attention. It was about white privilege. How would you explain white privilege to someone who never heard about it, and how is it related to racism?
Okay. Privilege, white privilege in particular, refers to those unearned advantages that you have in society by virtue of belonging to a particular group. So when we talk about white privilege, we're saying, you being white, you have certain privileges. I call it, it's like having a credit card, and it gets you into certain places and it gives you certain benefits only by virtue of how you look and where you and the group to which you belong. Now, some people will hear this and they'll say, are you saying that my life hasn't been difficult? Are you saying that I haven't faced hardship? Are you saying that things have not been difficult for me? Not at all. But I can guarantee you, if you are white, given the society that you live in, you probably not only do not receive negative impact because of your skin tone, you probably receive positive benefit and you don't even notice it. So for example, if you are going in for loans, if you are starting a business, there's a presumption, for example, of competence. If you are walking down the street, there might be a presumption that you are just an average everyday citizen and you're incapable of doing anything that's committing a terrorist act or committing some type of harm. It's how we look at people and the things that they are not burdened with simply by being white. And so I don't want anybody to think that I'm suggesting that life is not difficult, but it's not based on race and it's not based on your group affiliation, based on ethnicity.
Joel, I have a very personal question for you now. When you hear the US President Donald Trump commenting on the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville back in 2017 and saying there were some very fine people on both sides. When you see the campaign of the Swedish clothing retailer H&M showing the black child and using the word monkey, or when you hear the stories about football fans in UK, in Spain, or in Slovakia making monkey noises or throwing bananas at black players, how do you feel? What's going on inside of you?
Well, it's hard to put in words. What I would say to you is that, first of all, with respect to the occupant of the White House, what I would say to you is it's surreal because you have someone who's supposed to be a global leader who is being very open about his racism. And I think the danger that we have now is that you have some people equating their views, especially white nationalist views, as just some aspect or part of diversity and inclusion. So what you'll hear is, well, you support your group and your people, and I'm simply supporting mine. And why isn't that a good thing? The difference is A person who's coming and saying, I want to have rights, is not saying that they're trying to deny the humanity of someone else. Their pride is not based on the oppression of different groups. What that comment in Charlottesville said that there's a false equivalency, and it's a particularly touchy issue for me because I went to school in Charlottesville. I went to grad school there, and I spent 3 years there. And so it was surreal, and I thought to myself, here we are, I think at the time in 2017, and we haven't evolved. We haven't made much progress. When I hear about the H&M example of someone saying, was it the greatest or the cutest little monkey in the world? It just tells me that people are not bringing in a diverse perspective into the corporate boardroom, into meetings and decisions, because there's no way that if a person really understood a multicultural perspective that they would have thought that that was appropriate. And what it says, once again, is how people view Blacks and Africans, no matter where they are in the diaspora. In terms of the other, I think, what was the other example that you mentioned?
Football fans.
I think that's an issue of racism. I think what we have to look at is stop putting blinders on and thinking that, I think what happens a lot of times with racism is we'll see very obvious examples of it and we try to rationalize, oh, they were just being rowdy. These were people just trying to antagonize the opposing player. But why did you choose that those particular slurs, or why did you make those particular noises? Because we're seeing that Blacks are seen as being inhuman, and that's a problem. And so we see it at all these different levels. And so all of these things together tell me that we still have a critical problem, whether we're talking about something as trivial as a soccer game or a football game, or we're seeing it come from someone who's supposed to be a key leader within the free world. It shows us that we really have not evolved. And in fact, things have gotten much worse because we have people rationalizing these things with academic language and academic prose and acting as though these things are normal when in fact they're not normal. In fact, they show a society that in some ways is very sick and is not healed.
I know there are many people who are not ignorant of racism and they want to help. They want to do something to address it. What options do they have?
There's a lot that we can do. And I'm glad you said it, because while this is a serious problem, I also think there are a lot of people who are taking this issue very seriously and are trying to do something about it. So I want to focus on the positive aspects. I think the first thing that people should do is just educate themselves, learn about other communities, learn about the world. That's why I travel. That's why I love to come to places like Slovakia, because I want to learn about different people. I think people should listen to stories, because the best learning is not going to come from an academic book. It's not going to come from a class. It's going to come from having the heart-to-heart connection with someone else and hearing what their experiences have been like. I think people should challenge their assumptions and their biases and stereotypes. We all have them. I hope that's not controversial for anyone. But even coming to Slovakia, I had to also manage and understand what my own biases are. And I think that's important for people to do. I think it's important to speak up when you see acts of racism, because a person who is a target may not have the same power. They may not have the same occasion. They may be paralyzed by fear or may not want to do so for fear of their own safety. I think people need to share information within their networks, in their communities, and their families. And I think people also need to be careful of white fragility. And what I mean by white fragility is the tendency to get defensive when a person is educating you about racism or about multiculturalism, because that's how we learn. And we all have to learn. Even for someone who's been doing this as long as I have, I've been doing this now for 20 plus years, there's always something to learn. And I think if we understand it, and I think if we understand that someone else's story is part of our own, and someone else's liberation is tied to our own freedom, then we'll be in a much better place. And so I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic. We'll see what happens, but I think things are going to be trending in a better place, because now we see with all these different examples that it's not something that's been resolved, and it's something that we need to give critical attention to.
So let me help our audience to learn about white fragility. So how does that reflect in specific situation? How does it look like in specific situation? If I don't want to show and reflect my white fragility, what should I do?
I think if someone gives you some feedback, it says, for example, that was offensive, I didn't like that, I would caution you or ask you to think about it. I think it's okay just to pause and to get yourself out of that mode where you feel triggered, you feel upset, you feel bothered. Reflect, ask questions, and also talk to the person away and say, if I have other questions, tell me more about your perspective, help me to learn more. That doesn't mean that you always have to agree. It means it's creating the space so that you really understand and empathize with where the person is coming from. And empathy to me is not having the same experience, but having the same core experience. So even if I am a Syrian refugee, even if I grew up in some place like Namibia, what is the core emotion the person is trying to explain? If they feel disenfranchised, if they feel like they've been isolated, they feel lonely. And I think all of us at some point can relate to a range of emotions. That's how you get out of the fragility piece, is when you take the focus away from yourself and try to make sure that you're creating space to understand the other person's life and journey as well.
So it means it's shifting the attention from myself, like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it this way, and now I will be blaming myself. So instead of doing that, it's shifting the attention back to the point that we've been discussing.
Right. Creating the space to actually hear.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say to anybody, if you have a family, you have a significant other or a spouse, I'm sure you've dealt with that dynamic where someone says something that may be unusual or may be surprising, and you may feel attacked. But at the same time, if you want to further and strengthen that relationship, you have to create the space to really listen to what they have to say and and show some curiosity. So what I say to people is show some curiosity, show some resilience, show some grace, show some kindness. That's how we can shift these dynamics so that we're not talking at each other and we're really learning to listen to each other.
Joel, thank you very much for being with us today and for helping us understand what racism is and what each of us can do to address it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Racism is indeed one of the major failures of humanity, and it will be very challenging to eliminate it at institutional level. At a personal level, though, we can do a lot. As one of my favorite songs says, I'm starting with the man in the mirror. I'm asking him to change his way. Thank you very much for watching us today, and be curious. We're gonna be back with some interesting guests and very interesting topic.